Welcome to Rosie's. Today we're going to go over how to build a basic pendant. We'll be using a poppy jasper cab today, but any stone would work for this pendant. It's going to be just your basic construction out of sterling silver. Come on in and watch. Today's video, we're going to build a simple pendant like this with a piece of poppy jasper. Start off the process today. We'll start with a medium-sized stone, one with some great color and look to it. This will be the stone that we build our pendant with today. Let's get started with our stone today. It's a poppy jasper cab. It has about an 1/8 inch girdle on it, as you can see here. So we're going to start with a 1/8 plain bezel. It's 28 gauge. We're going to start wrap the stone and solder the bezel together as our first step. We're going to wrap the stone with an 1/8 inch bezel. We want the bezel wire to fit this snugly. We're going to wrap the bezel wire around the stone, make sure there's no gaps in it, and then right at the point of intersection, we'll mark it clearly with using the tweezers for a scribe. This is very important to have a nice pair of flush cut cutters at this point. Nice square edge right here on the bezel. And then we're going to align the end of the bezels up nicely, and then we'll solder it. It's very critical that the ends of this bezel wire are lined up both horizontally and vertically, that the seam is even. If at this time, if you're having problems with the seam, it'd be a great opportunity to take a file and clean it up. This is the whole start of your piece, the foundation of it. Make sure it's right. I'm going to use a very small piece of hard solder. We're using a paste-based flux here. We're going to flex our solder joint, place a very small piece of solder on the joint itself. There are multiple ways to solder this. I choose to hang it. You could use it on a solder block and just wick the solder up. This has worked well for me. Once this gap is soldered shut, you want to inspect it to make sure it's a clean solder joint. A little water, nice even solder joint on it. We'll clean up the joint a bit, double check the fit on the stone, and go forward from there. Once the bezel's soldered together, you fit it to the stone. Use a flat object, go around the stone, make sure all your gaps are even, and check these on the back of the stone that it's even all the way around the stone. This is ready to solder onto a backing plate. Now that we're happy with the bezel and the way that it fits the stone, we're going to take a piece of 22 gauge sterling silver sheet and we're going to cut out the shape of our pendant and prepare it for setting the bezel onto the backing plate. For this pendant, we're using a slightly larger backing plate than we need, but it gives us plenty of room to solder around it. I'm going to quickly cut this out. At this point, we have a piece that the pendant will fit on. We'll have room to solder around. Once it's soldered, we'll cut out the piece. We're going to put our sterling silver and our HALLMARK stamp on the back of the piece here. We're going to take a 3M scruffy pad and clean the back of this before we solder. Just enough to take the oxidation off of it. And we're going to carefully remove our bezel from our stone. We're going to apply flux. Set our bezel on here. And then we're going to take the solder we cut and position it inside the bezel in 3 or 4 spots around the inside. And we're ready for soldering. I've centered the bezel and placed the solder pieces around the inside. For this soldering, we're going to use a tripod and a wire rack and heat the piece from the bottom. It's still boiling around the edges. Once this flux is completely dry, we can apply more heat. We're going to start with the heat on the front of the piece and get this first part of the bezel. The flux will change from white to brown to clear. Once it reaches a clear stage, the solder will start flowing. We keep the torch moving all the time as not to melt the base. Here goes our solder. You can watch it wick right here. It's going to follow the piece around. I use a solder pick to make sure the bezel's completely seated. It's important to check and make sure your bezel fully soldered in and there's no gaps around the bottom. Once the solder's complete, cool your piece off. Our next step is to cut it out. We're following the outline of the shape here. We have our pendant cut out. We have a very rough edge from where we cut it with the saw. At this time, we're going to use a flex shaft with the sandpaper and file it back as close as we can without touching the bezel. Without a flex shaft, you still use a Dremel. Without a Dremel, file will take this off. File does a very clean job. It's a little more time consuming. Our next step is throw this in the pickle pot and remove the flux from soldering. We're going to use copper tongs to remove this from the pickle. The pickle's an acidic solution to clean the flux off the part. As you can see, it's pretty clean. We're left with a bit of a ridge on here, and we're going to come back and touch that up. See at this point that the lip is almost completely gone. We want to take that 100% till this lip is completely gone and it looks like one piece of silver. We've ground the base off till the line is completely gone and it looks like one piece of silver. Now that we've cleaned up the edges of the bezel and the cup for the stone looks great, we've verified that the stone will fit in the bezel properly. We're ready to do a jump ring on the back to hold the bail. In this case, we're going to use 14 gauge sterling silver wire. We're going to use a pair of pliers used for making bails. We're going to roll some silver around there and then we'll cut it into jump rings. We've wound up enough wire to make 3 jump rings. We're going to cut this off real quick. And then we're going to use our jeweler's saw. We're going to cut through the stack. And here's our jump rings. We're going to use this one here for the back of the pendant. We're going to take and close the gap on the jump ring. Then we'll clean the back of our pendant with our scruffy pad. We're going to solder this onto the back. We use a third hand to hold the jump ring. We're going to position the cut in our jump ring at the end of the pendant here. We'll flex it. We're going to add some easy solder for this step. This is our third step in the soldering process. Take a generous piece of solder. We're going to add it right here for where the bell meets the pendant. For this operation, we're going to apply heat to the back of the pendant until our flux is dry, making sure our solder stays in place. Then once the flux is dry, we're going to start moving the heat up, get the jump ring and the back of the pendant. Solder should jump up to the jump ring, and then we'll just bring it across like that. We're going to add just a tad more solder right here to secure our fit. We're going to put it back in the pickle pot. While it's taking a nap in the pickle pot, we're going to make a bail for this piece. So we're going to build the bail today, and the bail is the actual part that the cord or necklace chain will go through on the pendant we're building. We're going to start with a piece of 22 gauge silver. It's approximately 1 millimeter wide, and we're going to cut a piece 34 millimeters long off of it. We're going to mark the center so we have a reference to cut to, and we're going to cut this out. We'll stamp it and shape it. The center mark. This side we cut about 2/3 the way to the center mark. And then we're going to use our railroad tie, stamp a line through the center of this. At this point, we've taken our basics rectangular silver and we've trimmed it down to this point. Now we're going to add a decorative line through the center. Did you just nose bop him? It's a homemade liner stamp. It's made out of a file. We're going to use this stamp, put a line through the center of our bail we just built. And then it's ready to bend for a bail. We've used our liner stamp, put a line through the center. It's slightly off center. We'll fix that up with the sanding disc before we roll it. We're gonna blend the edges of this and center up our line a little bit. The corners we cut in, we'll round those up a little bit. These are actually called bail making pliers. That's what we're gonna use. We'll line up with the bottom step here and we're gonna roll our metal around and that'll form our bail. At this point, while the gap's still open, we're going to go fetch our piece out of the pickle pot and we'll actually close this around the jump ring on the pendant. We've recovered our pendant from the pickle pot. We have a bail in the rough shape. We're going to put the part that we cut short on the front, the longer part on the back. We're going to take a pair of pliers and close this completely. With the bail fully closed and pinched together, this is what it looks like now. And it's ready to solder the bail closed. We're going to use our third hand to hold the bail end up here. There's a tad of flux on it and some easy solder. Put a generous piece of solder right here on the end. Melt that closed. And one more brief trip to the pickle pot to remove flux from soldering the bail. We're back from the pickle pot. Piece is pretty spotless at this point. The next process is going to be to set the stone. To do this, we need a piece of dental floss, some sawdust, and some setting tools. We're going to use a bezel roller and a burnishing tool. We're going to use a piece of dental floss set across our bezel, and then we'll set the stone in. This will enable us to take the stone in and out. We're going to check the height of the stone at this point, and you can see that the stone is set a little bit deep. We're going to add that much filler underneath it to bring the stone up even with the top of the bezel. Our filler is going to be redwood sawdust. We're going to add enough sawdust to bring the stone up even with the top of the bezel. Again, we'll test fit it by placing a piece of dental floss across it. We'll set our stone in and we're going to check for the height again. We'll fully seat the stone against the dental floss. And now you can see the stone matches the bezel perfectly. We're going to remove the dental floss. And we're going to start with the bezel roller. We're going to start at the top where the tightest bend is. We're going to press down on our stone and then we'll roll the bezel over the top of it. We'll turn this pendant and continue rolling. We get down to the bottom and again, press the stone down, roll the bezel onto the pendant. At this point, the bezel should be completely closed, but not tight. The next step is to burnish the bezel. We'll use this edge of a burnisher. As you can see, we can see the top of the bezel right here. We're going to work the burnisher on it until that top is very thin. If you see at this point, it's very thin and it's against the stone. Here it's still wide and has some gaps. As we move around the stone with the burnisher, it'll close those and it'll work the top of the silver very thin. It'll give a great look to this pendant when it's complete. This is almost like scrubbing. If we get to a place like the top where we can't reach very well, we'll set it down and we'll use a backside to close it. You can see how that just worked in. Here's a little gap here. We'll work the other side. Now that our stone is completely secure in here, our next step is to polish the piece for its final look. Our next step in the process, and our final step, will be to polish this. And we're going to start with 2 steps. This is a coarse cutting buffer, and then we'll finish it up with ZAM on the other buffer. At this point, our polishing is complete. We're going to steam clean it, clean out the inside of the bail, and this product will be done. And there you have it. We have a completed sterling silver and poppy jasper pendant. To purchase this pendant or a similar pendant, visit our website at rosiessterlingsilver.com. That concludes today's video. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our videos. We'll have more to follow in making sterling silver jewelry. Thank you much.